This next video focuses on women artists and their involvement in abstract expressionism and other types of abstraction, also minimalism, post-minimalism, and land art. On the screen you see a work by Lee Krasner, a very important woman abstract expressionist, and then you also see a photograph of Peggy Guggenheim, a very important collector, because that's what we'll be focusing on in the end of the video, which will be women as museum founders, women who were patrons, who acquired art, and who were able to create very impressive collections. The collections we'll be thinking about are the Collezione Peggy Guggenheim, the museum that's in Venice, and then we'll also look at MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, which was founded by 3 women. And then lastly, we'll look at the Whitney, which was founded by a woman as well. So that'll be the end of this particular video. Starting off with Lee Krasner, we will focus in on her training. In the 1930s, she was trained under Hans Hofmann, so that was a quite prominent artist at the time. She began exploring abstraction, but also was trained to explore representational techniques as well, or representational styles as well. In this case, you're seeing a very abstract approach to a still life. So you see that it is a composed arrangement of elements. You can see elements of fruit there as well, but she's beginning to really break down her surfaces into pure abstraction. Lee Krasner is best known as the wife of Jackson Pollock. Unfortunately, that's most likely the case. So for Lee Krasner, she was very much overshadowed during her life by her very famous husband. Jackson Pollock is seen as one of the most important figures in abstract expressionism. He had this technique of placing his canvases on the floor, action painting, gestural abstraction. He would really fling the paint upon the canvas in this kind of rhythmic patterning. This was a period around and after World War II, where there was great value placed on personal, emotional expression. Canvases became large and overwhelming in scale, and many artists, not just Jackson Pollock or Lee Krasner, were exploring this style. Many other artists, primarily male, but also female as well, as we will see. Jackson Pollock was an alcoholic and could be quite violent, and so it was believed that Lee Krasner and Jackson Pollock moved out to the area of East Hampton on Long Island in order to kind of escape the temptations of New York. Eventually, however, Jackson Pollock would die in a car crash, kind of a drunk driving accident, and Lee Krasner would live on into the 1980s. In their house on Long Island, Jackson Pollock was able to work in a very large barn, and thus it allowed him to work on these large canvases, whereas Lee Krasner's studio was a bit smaller, and so she was not able to explore these larger canvases around this time. However, upon his death, she began working in the barn and began developing much larger canvases, and we'll look at some of those in just a minute. I just briefly wanted to show you an example of Jackson Pollock's work. This one is Autumn Rhythm. So you can see this is a very large painting, and it's overwhelming in kind of that gestural quality of the paint and how it's applied. So you can see how there is this certain kind of rhythmic quality here where you see the earthy toned paints underneath, and then you have the layering of the larger amounts of white paint and then the black that's covering it, and thinking about kind of responses to nature, thinking about the rhythm of seasons, and rather than representing it in a literal fashion, Jackson Pollock is doing it in an overwhelming kind of stylistic fashion, using this new technique of abstract expressionism. To see another example by Lee Krasner, seeing more of an early example from 1947. This is her work called Noon, and around this time she was exploring works that almost looked like small pictographs or small symbols that looked like pictographs or hieroglyphics. But you can see how she's really working her surfaces, how she's really exploring colors. This one called Noon, there's really a brightness to the canvas. There's a luminous quality to the hues that she's selected. There's a certain saturation to the color, and there's a wonderful quality about getting close to paintings like this because you're able to see the way she's thickly applying the paint. to see another example of where she's doing more of this pictograph technique. This is her Untitled from 1949. If we get close up, you can really see how those surfaces are very carefully worked and how she's really thinking about using paint and abstraction in order to engage the viewer and not necessarily representing something that's recognizable. It's something that seems to be exploring other levels of experience. So as I mentioned, after the death of Jackson Pollock, Lee Krasner's work becomes much larger, bolder, and explores that gestural abstraction in a bolder way. And so you can see in this cat image, she's really changed her palette. Her colors are starting to change. You see these pinks and magentas and reds and yellows, and she's again painting in kind of a less detailed fashion. It's more about these gestural strokes on the canvas. So you can see a kind of winding brush stroke here and another one going down along the canvas here. And again, these are large canvases, so she's really exploring scale in a similar way to how her husband had. This is her work Gaia. So thinking about feminine subject matter, the idea of the earth in this case. Again, these kind of bold gestures, and again, thinking about this different kind of palette, purples and pinks, and that's what we tend to see around this period. Moving on to another artist who is difficult to exactly categorize, that would be Louise Bourgeois, but still a very, very important artist who had an incredibly long career. Here I'm showing you a work called Femme-Maison, and this was part of a series that she did thinking about the housewife. So this really became a feminist work of art as well, the idea that it's exploring some of the trials of women who stay at home. Again, she had a very long life, and she was born in France but died in New York. She was said to host numerous salons in her home in New York. She had a very good relationship with the Museum of Modern Art in New York and was actually the first woman to receive a solo exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art, more commonly known as MoMA. So this one dates to the 1940s. Bourgeois' mother died in 1932, so she always had this kind of fraught relationship with her father, and then these memories of her mother. She did marry an art historian named Robert Goldwater and moved to New York with him in the 30s and had 3 children in the period of 4 years. We believe that after this happened, she must have been overwhelmed by this experience, the idea that she'd really lost some of her identity, perhaps, that it was incredibly difficult for her to be a professional artist, having 3 very young children. So this idea of a female body with the house sitting right on it, this idea of the overwhelming quality of the home. But also, some people put a more positive spin on it. This is in some other images from the same series, the idea that the woman is in charge of the home. So you could read it that way as well. But she does continue to explore this series in a variety of media. So here you see it in sculpture in white marble. Louise Bourgeois also is connected with more sexual representations, and she's often connected to representations that look quite organic. One of her most famous works is Filette from the 1960s, which is latex over plaster. It essentially looks like a phallus or a penis, but Filette literally means young woman in French. So it also looks like a torso. So there could be a torso with 2 legs extending out. So there's a certain ambiguity to it. Here you see Louise Bourgeois pictured with her Filette. And she was always exploring aspects of sexuality. She was thinking of masculine attributes as very delicate, as opposed to the typical reading where masculine aspects are viewed as tough and strong. So she definitely engaged with some unexpected views regarding sexuality. She's also very well known for representing spiders in her work. So her work is representational many times. It is representational. This is her work MoMA. These were dedicated to her mother. You can see this one's from 1999, cast in 2001, and now is featured outside the Guggenheim Bilbao. And she has a quote, "The spider is an ode to my mother. She was my best friend. Like a spider, my mother was a weaver. Like spiders, my mother was very clever. Spiders are friendly presences that eat mosquitoes. mosquitoes. We know that mosquitoes spread diseases and are therefore unwanted, so spiders are helpful and protected, just like my mother. And I always like this approach because most of us think of spiders as something we don't want in our homes, or something we don't want around, or something we think is scary. And Louise Bourgeois is really turning this on its head. She's saying, no, these are friendly presences, and she's connecting it to her mother. And sometimes the spiders will even have eggs featured down below, clearly marking them as mothers. Another abstract expressionist is Joan Mitchell. And so Joan Mitchell was a significant artist working in the 50s, the 60s, but an early example of her work, she's seen as a second-generation abstract expressionist, is called Cross-Section of a Bridge. A little bit difficult to see here, but you can think about early on she might have been exploring more representation, thinking about how things work, the internal structures of things. The quality or the style of her work is somewhat similar to what we see about a decade earlier, slightly less, by Ashel Gorky. So again, just exploring these kind of biomorphic forms, but in the case of Joan Mitchell, it becomes much more angular. Later on in Joan Mitchell's work, it becomes much more purely abstract. Her works tend to be quite large. Seeing them all together in an exhibition of Joan Mitchell's work can be quite an experience, because you really see how her work transforms from these more geometric forms later to these bright colors. She was very interested in Van Gogh, some of the colors of Matisse. You can see some of that influence here. She also ends up moving to France and living very close to where the artist Claude Monet lived, who was an important impressionist. And so she may have been interested in the kind of impressionist style, the use of color, and that seems to have influenced her painting techniques. Here we see her East 9th Street. Shortly thereafter, she'll head to France more permanently. Here's her work, Ladybug. We do see later on her palette becomes darker. Many people think this was influenced by the death of her father and also by the cancer diagnosis her mother received. So her palette does change, and she does explore nature and the feelings she gets from nature, the feelings she gets from seeing things. She often would say that her paintings are quite controlled, even though they look like they lack a certain level of control. She often would point out that they are quite controlled, and she has a clear sense of what she wants to represent in her canvases. Another later abstract expressionist, Helen Frankenthaler. This is her Mountains and Sea from 1952. These works the works by Helen Frankenthaler are really exploring a new technique when it comes to abstract expressionism. Rather than getting thick amounts of oil paint on the canvas, it's more about thinning the paint and staining the canvas. So she and artists like Morris Louis, who was inspired by Helen Frankenthaler, she and other artists began staining their canvases in this new technique that was received quite well by art critics like Clement Greenberg. So in this case, it's Mountains and Sea, so it is slightly representational. It was said to be inspired by a trip to the sea in Nova Scotia, and so you can get a sense of the water, the Atlantic Ocean, and the spray that might come over the landscape. But as you move to this side of the canvas, it does move closer or move farther and farther out into abstraction. So it's an interesting combination of abstraction and pure abstraction, non-representational and representational. And Mountains and Sea, the title, definitely gives us a sense of what we're seeing here. So as I was saying, her technique is staining. She would thin her paint with turpentine, and then she stains the canvases so that you really can't see distinct brushstrokes. Sometimes you can see splatters of paint, and sometimes you can see more thickly applied areas of paint. But by and large, it really is a staining technique, kind of a pure technique of painting where you aren't seeing individual brushstrokes. So a very impressive new way of interpreting abstraction. Here we see Helen Frankenthaler with her Mountains and Sea, so you get a sense of the scale. She created this in her 20s, so very early on in her career. You can also see in the works around her how she's exploring these stained work, this new stain technique. And even as her work carried on into the 1970s, even as she's thinking about minimalist styles that are becoming more popular, she really does stick with her traditional technique of staining. She really thinks this is really her kind of trademark technique, whereas it's quite different from Lee Krasner, whose style changed quite a bit over the course of her career. Moving away from painting slightly, we will be thinking about the work of Lee Bontecou, who we see here. Lee Bontecou was an artist who was exploring works that bridged between painting and sculpture. So they often hung on the wall like a painting, but they often emerged out towards the viewer like a sculpture. And she lived near a laundry that had industrial canvas belts. So there's this well-known story that she would use the material thrown out by the laundry, the old canvas belts, and she would stitch them together over kind of a steel structure to create these untitled works that essentially are these kind of spinning, turning vortexes. Some people say they look industrial. Some people say it's all about the black void at the center. Lee Bontecou was very interested in this idea of the void, the unknown, of the blackness at the center. And in this particular instance, you can see even other voids kind of peeking out as this spiral moves towards the outer edge. An even more dramatic instance of that is a work she created, another untitled, I believe it's a year later. Yes, a year later, 1961. And you can see here the void is even more distinct, that idea that it does look like you're moving into a nothingness because it emerges so far out from the view or from the wall. And again, really emphasizing this idea of sculpture and painting and not necessarily fitting into those precise categories, really bridging between those different categories. And even all the way into the 1990s, you can see Lee Bontecou continuing to think about these voids, these vortexes. Some people think of them as looking like engines, specifically jet engines, but you can see all of these around this particular pastel colored pencil, black paper drawing. So she's using black paper to emphasize those black voids in the background. Moving on to Eva Hesse, an important artist in the 1960s. However, she died in 1970. So shortly after this important work, Hang Up, was created, she unfortunately had a brain tumor and there were unsuccessful surgeries, and she died quite young in her 30s. But she's quite well known and celebrated for some of her contributions to minimalism and what's sometimes called post-minimalism. So in the 1960s and 70s, there was an interest in getting away from kind of the excess of abstraction, the pop art, and thinking about pure forms and really reducing art, kind of this reductive approach to art. But Eva Hesse is playing with expectations here. So we have basically a frame that's been wrapped in cloth and then painted with a gray, so not a bright color, a gray, and then this cord that's also been painted. And so you have this around here, and essentially it looks like a painting that's been turned around. So you're seeing the kind of the cord or hanger that hangs on the wall, but it's so large that it emerges out at the viewer, and it's not logically placed. I mean, the way a typical hanger would be on the back of a painting would be going kind of like this across, whereas this one goes from top to bottom and it reaches out to the viewer. And viewing this in a gallery is an unusual experience because you really have to walk around the work. You have to make an effort to avoid running into this particular work. So she really is thinking about interacting with the viewer. And so obviously Hang Up, you're thinking about this hanging device, but also in the 1960s, there was this idea of having a hang up, like something that bothered you or something that was a concern. So she's also playing with 1960s kind of colloquial expressions. Another work by Eva Hesse that's very well known is Ascension 2. This is galvanized steel and vinyl. So you get the sense that, again, really playing with viewer expectations. You have this desire to just reach in there, and it looks like it should be quite soft, but in fact it's galvanized steel and vinyl. So there's this wonderful tactile quality to her work, and again, really engages the viewer and what the viewer's expectations are. Another artist who's thinking about minimalism and post-minimalism is Lynda Benglis. And Lynda Benglis was a great promoter of her works, promoter of herself as an artist. She was very clever about how she promoted her new artworks that she had coming out. And she had this very distinct technique that she started using of acrylic foam. She would pour it and she would get these very unexpected shapes and forms, almost like abstract expressionism in a sculptural quality or sculptural form. And this one is called For Carl Andre. Carl Andre was a minimalist sculptor. He's also a very controversial figure because many people think that he was responsible for the death of Anna Mendieta, who was an artist we'll talk about in a later video. So he's a very controversial figure. He had created a work just a year before called 144 Magnesium Squares. So you see this one's from 1969 and this one's from 1970. 144 Magnesium Squares was part of a series that Carl Andre did where he has this very rigid square created from 144, so 12 on each side. He also made it in other materials like lead. But here Lynda Benglis is playing on the idea of the colors that we see in 144 magnesium squares in her other works, and she's essentially melting them together. And she's also thinking about the materials. So she's using this synthetic lab-made material, whereas Carl Andre is using natural materials. She's really trying to do a play of opposites here. And also she's, again, engaging the viewer in the sense of saying, why for Carl Andre? That's going to get you thinking, is she kind of playing a joke on him? Is she trying to make fun of his work? Is she trying to outdo his work? So it really puts her in dialogue with other artists in a very exciting way. Also in the 1970s, there was a phenomenon called land art that became very, very popular. And here we see the work of Alice Aycock, who continues to be a very important artist and continues to receive very large-scale commissions. She was interested in sculpture and in architecture and design. What's interesting about land art is it's ephemeral in many ways. This maze, which was erected in Pennsylvania, no longer exists. So often it's affected by the elements and thus it does not last forever. Now she creates sculptures out of materials that are intended to last longer, but many of them are quite ephemeral, especially early on. So in Maze, you were intended to walk through the structure. You were supposed to move through it, and really it needed the viewer to complete the work. And that was something that was important for Alice Aycock. You can see you would move through these fences. They would be much taller than you are, so there would be kind of a frightening experience. How do you get through? How do you reach the end? So you get a sense of scale from the figure here. But anyways, it's a particularly interesting example when you think about it in relation to some of the other land art that was being created, such as Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty that dates to 2 years before. Robert Smithson was seen as one of the most significant artists in the land art movements. His Spiral Jetty in the Great Salt Lake is also affected by the elements. So there was a long time when it was completely covered, and then there are certain periods when it's revealed. It changes color based on how what's going on in the lake. So this idea of creating art that responds to the elements around it. And again, that really requires the viewer to see it because a person that visits it obviously isn't going to have these aerial views. A person that visits this is going to be walking through it. It's going to be much larger than they are. Same thing here. A person who visits this Spiral Jetty is going to walk along this spiral and notice the sounds and notice the materials that are used. And these were monumental projects. They took a lot of time and energy and funds in order to create. Just to show you quickly an example of the kind of installation that Alice Aycock still does today. So she does use more enduring materials in some cases, but she still is a very significant artist and creates these large-scale sculptures. All right, so to quickly go through a few examples of women being very important in founding museums in the 20th century, we'll start with the Collezione Peggy Guggenheim. So Peggy Guggenheim is often called eccentric. She called herself an art addict. She collected a lot of art and she was able to do it at a relatively low cost. She was a part of the Guggenheim family, a quite wealthy family, although she always claimed she did not have the money of, say, say her uncle Solomon. So she always said she was kind of a poor Guggenheim, but of course that's a relative term. She was pretty well off. So she was able to take money that she'd received from her family. She was able to found galleries. She had a very well-known gallery in New York, Art of this Century, and put on important exhibitions, including exhibitions of women artists. She also was credited with promoting Jackson Pollock and also giving him essentially a stipend. She often was a patron of the artists, and of course she did buy their artworks, although she was said to drive a hard bargain. She did eventually move to Venice, so this is the home that she purchased along the Grand Canal, and today it is a public museum. Her collection was very personal. Her life and her art were interconnected, and so many people say that this collection is a very personal collection. When you visit this museum, you really do feel a personal connection to Peggy herself, especially because her art was so significant. Her daughter was also an artist, and her art is featured at the museum too. Another very famous founding would be the founding of MoMA by Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, Lillie P. Bliss, and Mary Quinn Sullivan. These three women worked together, and often Abby Rockefeller is really credited with a lot of the legwork, but all were very significant in terms of thinking about what art to acquire and where to open a museum that was about the art of the 20th century, the art of their time. They didn't really have that in New York at that time, and they felt like it was important to have a museum that exemplified that. So it's interesting, they started off in rented office area, and then they moved into a townhouse, then they moved into a building in Midtown Manhattan, and then they expanded and expanded, and they recently expanded again. So there's been this kind of constant demand for more space. Obviously, as time has gone on, the modern collection has become more expansive, but it was interesting because these women founded this collection. Again, it started in this rented office space, and they ran out of space. It was too crowded. Too many people were coming. So it's interesting how people originally felt there wouldn't be that much interest in this museum. However, there's incredible interest, and now today millions of people go to MoMA every year, and it's one of the most popular museums in New York. The last example is the Whitney Museum, which again started in a smaller kind of studio structure, eventually moved to this well-known Breuer building, and now has a new space in New York. And so this is all in New York. And so here you can see Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, who was actually a sculptor in her own right, but she eventually acquired over 500 works of American art. So that's really where the Whitney Museum, that's its specialty, American art. She felt like people were collecting the art of Europe. People were collecting who were the most important 20th century European artists, but she felt like American artists weren't necessarily getting their due. And she was quite clever because as the 20th century progressed, there were so many important American artists during that time. And as an artist herself, she probably brought a unique perspective to the collection. So she actually acquired about 500 works of art, and she offered to donate them to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which is probably the most traditional kind of old master museum in New York, and they declined her gift. They did not want it. And so this was where Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney felt like this was really her chance to start her own collection, her own area for display, and eventually it grew and grew after that. So all three museums have become incredibly popular. All three women did come from wealthy families, so that allowed them the funds to start up these museums and to really get them going. And what's interesting is all of them were later led by male directors. So it wasn't like these women were necessarily the main managers of the museum, but they really were the visionaries that got these museums going and are so important in the history of museums in places like New York, and then of course with Peggy Guggenheim in Venice. So that's, I think, a nice way to think about these important women founders.